The morning started like any other at Kensington Palace. Prince William was reviewing his schedule over breakfast, while Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was getting their children ready for school. The familiar routine of royal life had become their comfort zone, but neither of them knew that this particular Tuesday would change everything they thought they knew about their family. Catherine noticed William seemed quieter than usual as he stirred his coffee. His phone had been buzzing with calls from palace officials since 6 in the morning, and each conversation seemed to leave him more troubled than the last. She watched him push his eggs around his plate, barely eating anything. "What's wrong?" Catherine asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "You've been on edge all morning." William looked up from his phone. His blue eyes filled with concern. "It's probably nothing," he said, but his voice betrayed his worry. "Just some unusual reports from the palace staff. They're saying some things that don't quite add up." The children's laughter echoed from upstairs as they got ready for school, a stark contrast to the tension building in the breakfast room. Prince George was practicing his spelling words aloud, while Princess Charlotte was singing a song she'd learned in music class. Prince Louis was chattering away to his nanny about the toy airplane he wanted to bring for show and tell. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warm morning sun streaming through the windows. In their years of marriage, she had learned to read William's moods perfectly. This wasn't just concern about royal duties or public appearances. This was something deeper, something that was shaking him to his core. "What kind of reports?" She pressed gently, knowing that sometimes William tried to protect her from palace drama. Before William could answer, his private secretary, James, entered the room with an expression that made both of them sit up straighter. James had been with the royal family for over a decade, and Catherine had never seen him look so pale. "Your Royal Highnesses," James began, his usual formal tone trembling slightly, "I'm afraid we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." William stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "What kind of situation, James?" "Sir, it's about the documents we discovered yesterday in the archive room. The ones that were sealed and marked for your father's eyes only." James glanced nervously between William and Catherine. "I think you both need to see what we've found." Catherine felt her heart begin to race. The archive room in the palace basement contained centuries of royal documents, many of which held family secrets that were meant to stay buried. She had only been down there once, shortly after her marriage to William, and the experience had left her feeling unsettled by the weight of history those walls contained. "Can't this wait until after we take the children to school?" Catherine asked, though she could see from both men's faces that whatever this was about, it couldn't wait. "I'm afraid not, ma'am," James replied. "The matter involves information that could potentially impact the entire royal family. We need to address it before anyone else discovers what we've found." William moved to Catherine's side and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. She could feel the tension in his touch, the way his fingers gripped just a little too tightly. Whatever was in those documents had already begun to unravel something fundamental about their understanding of their family's history. "All right," William said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used during official functions. "Let's go see what this is about. But James, I want you to make sure the children's routine isn't disturbed. They go to school as planned, and no one is to mention any of this to them until we understand what we're dealing with." As they followed James through the palace corridors, Catherine noticed how the usually bustling staff seemed to avoid eye contact with them. Maids hurried past with their heads down, and even the guards seemed more rigid than usual. Word of whatever they had discovered was clearly spreading through the palace, creating an atmosphere of tension that was almost suffocating. The walk to the archive room felt endless. Their footsteps echoed off the marble floors, creating a rhythm that matched Catherine's rapidly beating heart. She found herself thinking about their children upstairs, innocent and unaware that their world might be about to change forever. "William," she whispered, as they descended the narrow stone steps to the basement. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." He squeezed her hand without looking at her, his jaw set in determination. "I know," he replied quietly. "But Catherine, I have a feeling that after today, nothing is going to be the same." The archive room was exactly as Catherine remembered it. Rows upon rows of wooden shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, metal filing cabinets, and document boxes stretching back through centuries of royal history. The air smelled of old paper and leather, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of secrets long kept. James led them to a large oak table in the center of the room where several documents were spread out under bright examination lights. Two other palace officials stood nearby, Sir Richard, the keeper of the Royal Archives, and Mrs. Thompson, the chief archivist who had discovered the documents. "Your Royal Highnesses," Sir Richard began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "What we found yesterday changes everything we thought we knew about the royal lineage." Catherine felt William's hand tighten around hers as they approached the table. The documents spread before them looked old, much older than anything she had expected to see. The paper was yellowed with age, and the writing was in an elaborate script that was difficult to read. These documents were hidden behind a false wall in the eastern section of the archives, Mrs. Thompson explained, her voice barely above a whisper. They were sealed with wax and marked with instructions that they were only to be opened in the event of a direct threat to the royal succession. "What kind of threat?" William asked, though Catherine could tell from his tone that he was dreading the answer. Sir Richard picked up one of the documents with gloved hands, treating it like the explosive piece of history it clearly was. "Sir, these papers contain evidence of a marriage that was never recorded in the official royal records, a marriage that, if legitimate, would change the entire line of succession." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the palace coming to life above them. Catherine felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted, leaving her unsteady and grasping for something solid to hold on to. "Whose marriage?" William asked, his voice barely audible. "Your grandfather's, sir," Mrs. Thompson replied. "Before he married your grandmother, he was apparently married to someone else, and according to these documents, that marriage was never properly annulled." Catherine watched as all the color drained from William's face. His grandfather's first marriage had been something of a family mystery, with hints and whispers, but never any concrete evidence. If these documents were authentic, it meant that William's grandmother's marriage might not have been legal, which would make his father's claim to the throne questionable, and by extension, William's own future as king. "Are you certain these documents are authentic?" Catherine asked, finding her voice despite the shock that was coursing through her system. "We've had our best experts examine them throughout the night," Sir Richard replied. "The paper, the ink, the seals, everything appears to be genuine. But more importantly, there are references in these documents to something else, something that we haven't been able to locate yet." "What kind of something?" William asked, though Catherine could see that he was almost afraid to know. "There are mentions of a child from the first marriage," Mrs. Thompson said quietly. "A child who would have been the legitimate heir, but who supposedly died in infancy. However, these documents suggest that the child might not have died at all, but was instead hidden away to protect the royal succession." The implications of what she was saying hit Catherine like a physical blow. If there was a living descendant from the legitimate marriage, someone who had been hidden away for decades, it could potentially invalidate everything about the current royal line. "That's impossible," William said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Surely if such a person existed, we would have known about it by now." "Sir," James spoke up from where he had been standing quietly by the door. "There's something else. We've been tracking down every lead in these documents, and we believe we may have found something, or rather, someone." Catherine felt her legs go weak, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "What do you mean, someone?" "We think we may have located this person," James continued. "Someone who has been living quietly, unaware of their true identity. Someone who could potentially have a legitimate claim to the throne." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine looked at William and saw her own shock and fear reflected in his eyes. Everything they had built their lives on, everything they had prepared their children for, could be about to crumble around them. "Where?" William asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "That's what we need to discuss, sir," Sir Richard said. "Because according to our research, this person lives less than 50 miles from here. And, sir, they've been trying to contact the palace for weeks, claiming to have information about their family history that they believe might be of interest to your Royal Highness." Catherine felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the full impact of the situation began to sink in. Not only might there be someone with a claim to the throne that superseded William's, but that person had been trying to reach them. They had been trying to tell them something, and the palace had probably dismissed them as just another person with delusions of royal connections. "We need to meet with this person," William said, his voice stronger now as his royal training kicked in. "We need to understand exactly what they know and what they want." "Sir," James said carefully, "there's one more thing. This person specifically requested to meet with both you and the Princess of Wales. They said they have something to show you both that would prove their identity beyond any doubt." As they climbed the stairs back to the main palace, Catherine's mind was racing with questions and fears. How could they explain this to their children if it turned out to be true? How could they prepare them for the possibility that their father might not become king after all? And most importantly, who was this mysterious person who claimed to hold the key to their family's future? The morning sun was still streaming through the palace windows, but everything looked different now. The familiar corridors seemed foreign. The portraits of previous monarchs seemed to watch them with knowing eyes, and even the sound of their children's voices from upstairs felt like it was coming from a different world entirely. "We'll face this together," Catherine whispered to William as they reached the top of the stairs. "Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that their family and their entire way of life was about to be changed forever by whatever truth lay waiting behind the door they would soon have to open. 3 days had passed since the discovery in the archives, and the atmosphere at Kensington Palace had grown increasingly tense. William barely slept, spending most of his nights pacing the floors or staring out the window at the London skyline. Catherine found herself jumping at every phone call, every knock at the door, every unexpected sound that might signal another earth-shattering revelation. The children sensed something was wrong, despite their parents' attempts to maintain normalcy. George had asked twice why his father seemed so serious lately, and Charlotte had noticed that her mother's smiles didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. Even little Louis seemed more subdued, clinging closer to Catherine during their evening story time. "Mommy," Charlotte had whispered the night before, "is Papa going to be king, like Grandpa Charles?" The innocent question had nearly brought Catherine to tears. How do you answer a child when you're no longer certain of anything? She had simply hugged Charlotte tighter and told her that Papa would always be their king, no matter what. Now, as they sat in William's private study on Thursday afternoon, they were about to meet the person who might hold the answers to all their questions. James had arranged for the meeting to take place away from the main palace areas in a room that offered complete privacy and security. "Are you ready for this?" William asked, though Catherine could see he was asking himself as much as her. "I don't think anyone could be ready for something like this," she replied honestly. "But we need to know the truth." James knocked softly on the door and entered. "Your Royal Highnesses, our guest has arrived. Should I bring them in?" William stood up and straightened his tie, a nervous habit Catherine had noticed he'd developed over the past few days. "Yes, please show them in." The door opened again, and James stepped aside to allow their visitor to enter. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat as she saw who it was. She had been expecting someone elderly, perhaps someone who looked obviously connected to the royal family. Instead, the person who walked through the door was a woman who appeared to be in her 50s, with graying brown hair and kind eyes that seemed oddly familiar. "Your Royal Highnesses," the woman said, offering a nervous curtsy. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you both." Her voice was soft but clear, with a slight Scottish accent that reminded Catherine of some of William's distant relatives. She was dressed simply but elegantly in a navy blue dress and carried a worn leather portfolio that looked like it had been well used over many years. "Please, sit down," William said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "I understand you have information about our family that you believe we should know." The woman, James had introduced her as Margaret MacLeod, settled into the chair and carefully placed her portfolio on the small table beside her. "Your Highness, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I have proof of everything I'm going to say." Catherine found herself studying Margaret's face, trying to understand what it was about her that seemed so familiar. There was something about the way she held her head, the shape of her eyes, even the way she clasped her hands in her lap that reminded Catherine of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. "Please go ahead," Catherine said gently. "We're listening." Margaret took a deep breath and opened her portfolio. "My name is Margaret MacLeod, and I was born Margaret Windsor 53 years ago. I was told my entire life that I was adopted, that my birth parents had died in a car accident when I was just 6 months old." She pulled out a photograph and placed it on the table where both William and Catherine could see it. It showed a young couple standing in what looked like a small chapel, with an older man who appeared to be officiating some kind of ceremony. "This is my mother and father on their wedding day," Margaret continued. "My mother was Lady Elizabeth Hartwell, and my father was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, your grandfather's younger brother." Catherine felt the room spin slightly as she processed what Margaret was saying. Prince Edward had been William's great-uncle, a man who had died in a plane crash when William was very young. But according to the official records, Edward had never married or had children. "That's impossible," William said, though his voice lacked the conviction it would have had a week ago. "Uncle Edward never married. He died in 1972 in a military exercise." "He died in 1973, Margaret corrected gently. "And he did marry, in a private ceremony in Scotland in 1969. The marriage was kept secret because my mother was considered unsuitable. She was from a good family but not royal, and she had been previously married." She pulled out another document from her portfolio, this one clearly very old and official-looking. "This is their marriage certificate registered in Edinburgh, and this," she produced another paper, "is my birth certificate showing both my parents' names and my legitimate birth in 1970. Catherine leaned forward to examine the documents, her mind racing. If these papers were authentic, it meant that Margaret was legitimate royal family with a bloodline that could potentially impact the succession. But more than that, it meant that there was a whole branch of the family that had been hidden away for decades. "Why are you coming forward now?" William asked. "If you've known about this your whole life, why wait until now to contact us?" Margaret's expression grew sad, and Catherine could see unshed tears in her eyes. "Because I didn't know, Your Highness. I only found out the truth 6 months ago when my adoptive mother died and I was going through her papers. She had kept everything, every document, every letter, every photograph, hidden away in an old trunk in her attic." She reached back into her portfolio and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "These are letters from my father to my mother. written right up until his death. In them, he talks about the pressure from the royal family to keep our existence secret, about the threats that were made about what would happen if the truth ever came out. Threats? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My mother was told that if she ever revealed the truth about their marriage or my existence, both she and I would be in danger, Margaret explained. She was given money to disappear, to create a new identity, and to never contact the royal family again. My adoptive parents were distant relatives who agreed to raise me as their own in exchange for financial support. William was studying the letters now, his face growing paler with each page he read. Catherine could see him recognizing something in the handwriting, in the references to family members and palace protocols that only someone with intimate knowledge of royal life would know. These letters mention specific events, specific people that only Uncle Edward would have known about, William said quietly. Details that weren't public knowledge. There's more, Margaret said, reaching for the final item in her portfolio. My father left something for me, something that he said would prove my identity beyond any doubt if I ever needed to claim my place in the family. She pulled out a small, velvet-covered box and placed it carefully on the table. He said this had been in the royal family for generations, passed down through the male line. He gave it to my mother just before he died, telling her to keep it safe for me. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the box to reveal a signet ring with the royal coat of arms, but with subtle differences that Catherine had never seen before. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly very old and very valuable. William reached for the ring with shaking hands. As soon as he picked it up, Catherine saw his face change completely. This is the original Kent family signet ring, he whispered. I've seen references to it in the family archives, but it was supposed to have been lost decades ago. Your father told my mother that this ring was proof of our legitimacy, Margaret said. That if anything ever happened to him, this ring would serve as evidence that their marriage and my birth were real and legally binding. The room fell into silence as the full implications of what they were hearing began to sink in. Catherine found herself thinking about all the times over the years when she had wondered about the gaps in the family history, the stories that seemed incomplete, the relatives who were mentioned only in passing and never discussed in detail. Margaret, Catherine said carefully, what is it that you want from us? Why did you decide to reach out now? Margaret looked at both of them with an expression that was both hopeful and fearful. I don't want anything from you, she said. I don't want titles or recognition or money. I just want to know my family. I want to understand where I come from. She paused, and Catherine could see her struggling with emotion. I've spent my whole life feeling like something was missing, like there was a part of me that I could never quite understand. When I found out the truth, it all suddenly made sense. But I also realized that I wasn't just discovering my own history, I was potentially disrupting yours. What do you mean? William asked, though Catherine suspected they both already knew the answer. According to the documents I found, my father was actually older than your grandfather, Margaret said quietly. If the birth records are accurate, and if his marriage to my mother was legitimate, then the line of succession might not be what everyone thinks it is. Catherine felt her world tilt on its axis as the full meaning of Margaret's words became clear. If Prince Edward was older than William's grandfather, and if his marriage was legitimate, then Margaret might actually have a stronger claim to the throne than Charles, than William, than their children. The documents I found suggest that my father was born 18 months before your grandfather, but that the birth records were altered to make it appear that your grandfather was the elder, Margaret continued. There are letters discussing the decision to hide my father's true age to preserve the succession line that had already been established. William stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the same pose Catherine had seen his father use countless times when dealing with difficult situations. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was trying to process information that challenged everything he had been raised to believe about his family and his future role. "Margaret," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice steady, "do you understand what you're telling us? If what you're saying is true, it could change the entire monarchy." "I know," Margaret replied, and there were tears in her eyes now. "That's why I've been so afraid to come forward. I never wanted to hurt anyone or cause a constitutional crisis, but I also felt like I couldn't live with the lie anymore." She stood up and moved to where William was standing by the window. "Your Highness, I want you to know that I have no intention of making any public claims or causing any disruption to your family. I just wanted you to know the truth, and I wanted the chance to meet the family I never knew I had." William turned around, and Catherine was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "Margaret, if what you're telling us is true, then you're not just our family, you're our elder. According to royal protocol, we should be the ones showing deference to you." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Protocol doesn't matter to me. Family does. And regardless of birth order or succession lines, you are the king that this country needs. You've been trained for this role your entire life, you understand the responsibilities, and you have the support of the people." Catherine felt a surge of admiration for this woman who had just turned their world upside down, but who was showing such grace and consideration for their feelings. There was something about Margaret's demeanor, her thoughtfulness, her obvious intelligence, that reminded Catherine strongly of William's father. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. "How do we verify all of this? How do we determine what impact it might have?" "I've brought copies of everything for your experts to examine," Margaret said, returning to her seat. "I want independent verification as much as you do. If I'm wrong about any of this, if the documents are forged or the timeline is incorrect, then I want to know." "And if you're right?" William asked, returning to sit beside Catherine. "If everything you're telling us is true, what then?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see her weighing her words carefully. "Then we figure out how to move forward as a family," she said finally. "Because regardless of titles or succession lines, that's what we are. We're family." As the afternoon wore on, and they continued to examine documents and share stories, Catherine found herself warming to Margaret in a way she hadn't expected. There was something genuine about her, something that felt authentic and trustworthy. But more than that, there were small mannerisms, facial expressions, and ways of speaking that felt undeniably familiar. "Margaret," Catherine said during a brief pause in their conversation, "would you be willing to stay for dinner? I think it would be good for the children to meet you, even if we just introduce you as a family friend for now." Margaret's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "I would be honored, Your Highness. I've wondered so often what it would be like to meet the next generation of our family." As James was called to arrange for dinner and additional security clearance for Margaret, Catherine found herself thinking about how drastically their lives had changed in just a few short days. A week ago, their biggest concern had been Charlotte's upcoming school play and George's piano lessons. Now they were facing questions that could reshape the entire monarchy. But as she watched William and Margaret poring over family photographs and sharing stories about relatives they both remembered hearing about, Catherine felt something she hadn't expected. Despite the chaos and uncertainty, despite the potential upheaval to everything they had planned for their future, she felt a sense of completeness that had been missing before. For the first time since this all began, Catherine allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out exactly as it was meant to. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret's first visit to Kensington Palace, and the royal household had been quietly buzzing with activity as experts worked around the clock to verify her claims. Catherine had barely slept, lying awake each night wondering how their children's lives might change if Margaret's story proved to be true. The DNA test results were due to arrive today, along with the final authentication reports on all the documents Margaret had provided. William had aged years in just these few short weeks, the weight of potential constitutional crisis pressing down on him like a physical burden. "Mummy," George had asked that morning over breakfast, "why has Aunt Margaret been visiting so much? Is she really our family?" Catherine had hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to their 9-year-old son. "She might be, sweetheart. We're still learning about our family history." "I like her," Charlotte had chimed in. "She tells funny stories about when Papa's grandfather was little." Indeed, Margaret had become a regular presence at the palace over the past 2 weeks. What had started as formal meetings to verify her claims had evolved into something much more personal. She had joined them for several family dinners, played games with the children, and shared stories about the royal family that even William had never heard before. Catherine found herself genuinely fond of Margaret, but that only made the situation more complex. If the DNA results confirmed that Margaret was indeed royal family, it would bring joy to discover a new relative, but it would also mean that everything they thought they knew about the succession was wrong. Now, as they sat in William's study, waiting for Sir Richard to arrive with the final results, Catherine reached for her husband's hand. His palm was damp with perspiration, and she could see the tension in his jaw. "Whatever the results are, we'll handle this together," she whispered. "Catherine," William said, his voice heavy with emotion. "What if she's right? What if I'm not meant to be king? What if our children's entire future has been built on a lie?" Before Catherine could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. James entered, followed by Sir Richard, Mrs. Thompson, and several other palace officials. Their faces were grave, and Catherine felt her heart sink. Bad news, then. "Your Royal Highnesses," Sir Richard began, his voice more serious than Catherine had ever heard it. "We have completed our analysis of all the documents and evidence provided by Ms. MacLeod." He paused, and Catherine could see him struggling with how to deliver what was clearly earth-shattering news. "Sir Richard," William said, his voice steady despite his obvious anxiety, "please just tell us what you've found." "Sir, the documents are authentic, every single one of them. The marriage certificate, the birth records, the letters, they all check out. The paper, ink, seals, and handwriting have all been verified by independent experts." Catherine felt the room spin around her as the implications began to sink in. If the documents were real, then Margaret really was legitimate royal family. But Sir Richard wasn't finished. "Furthermore, sir, the DNA results confirm that Ms. MacLeod is indeed your cousin, and that her paternal lineage can be traced directly back to King George V." William was very quiet, staring at his hands. Catherine could see him processing this information, trying to understand what it meant for their family and their future. "Is there more?" Catherine asked, sensing that Sir Richard was holding something back. "Yes, ma'am. We've also been able to verify the birth dates in question. Prince Edward was indeed born 18 months before your grandfather, which would make Ms. MacLeod's bloodline the senior royal line." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine felt as if everything solid in her world had just crumbled away. Not only was Margaret legitimate family, but she actually had a stronger claim to the throne than William. "However," Sir Richard continued, and Catherine looked up sharply at the change in his tone, "there is something else we discovered during our investigation, something that changes everything." He pulled out another document, this one looking much newer than the others they had been examining. "While researching the original succession records, we found this document in a different section of the archives. It's a formal renunciation of claim to the throne, signed by Prince Edward in 1972, just months before his death. Catherine felt her breath catch as Sir Richard placed the document on the table where they could all see it. In this document, Prince Edward formally renounces any claim to the throne for himself and any potential heirs. He states that he believes his younger brother is better suited to the role and that he has no desire to disrupt the established succession line. William reached for the document with shaking hands. "This is definitely Uncle Edward's signature," he said, after examining it carefully. "I've seen it on family letters and official documents." "But wait," Catherine said, her mind racing. "If Edward renounced his claim before Margaret was born, wouldn't that automatically exclude her from the succession as well?" "That's where it gets complicated, ma'am," Mrs. Thompson spoke up. "The renunciation was made before Ms. MacLeod's birth was publicly acknowledged. Prince Edward may not have known that his daughter had survived, or he may have believed that the renunciation wouldn't affect children born after the fact." Sir Richard nodded gravely. "Which brings us to the most important discovery of all. We found one final document, hidden in Prince Edward's personal papers. A letter addressed to Ms. MacLeod herself, to be opened only in the event that she ever discovered the truth about her parentage." Catherine felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "Margaret doesn't know about this letter?" "No, ma'am. We wanted to discuss it with you first, given its potential implications." "What does it say?" William asked. "Sir, perhaps it would be better if Ms. MacLeod were here to read it herself. The letter appears to contain Prince Edward's final wishes regarding the succession, as well as personal messages for his daughter." Catherine looked at William and saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They had spent 2 weeks agonizing over constitutional crises and succession disputes. But at the heart of it all was a father's love for the daughter he had been forced to give up. "Call Margaret," William said quietly. "She has a right to hear this from her father, even if it's 50 years too late." 20 minutes later, Margaret arrived at the palace, her face flushed from hurrying and her eyes wide with concern. Catherine had grown close enough to her over the past 2 weeks to recognize the signs that Margaret was trying to prepare herself for bad news. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked as she was shown into the study. "James said it was urgent." "Margaret, please sit down," William said gently. "We've received all the test results, and we have something very important to share with you." As Sir Richard explained about the document authentication and DNA confirmation, Catherine watched Margaret's face cycle through shock, relief, and something that might have been grief for all the years of family connection she had missed. "So, it's all true," Margaret said quietly. "Everything I suspected, everything I hoped and feared, it's all real." "Yes," William replied. "You are absolutely our family, and according to the original succession laws, you would have had a legitimate claim to the throne." "Would have had?" Margaret asked, picking up on his choice of words. "Margaret," Catherine said gently, "your father left something for you. A letter that explains his final wishes about the succession and about your place in the family." Sir Richard handed Margaret the sealed envelope, and Catherine could see her hands trembling as she took it. The envelope was thick, clearly containing several pages, and Margaret's name was written on it in what was unmistakably the same handwriting they had seen in all of Prince Edward's other letters. "Would you like some privacy to read this?" Catherine asked. "No," Margaret said, her voice shaking with emotion. "If this affects the royal family, then you should hear it too." She carefully opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of handwritten text. As she began to read, tears started flowing down her cheeks, and Catherine felt her own eyes beginning to water in sympathy. "What does it say?" William asked gently after Margaret had read in silence for several minutes. Margaret looked up at them, her face a mixture of sadness and peace. "He says he's sorry," she began, her voice breaking. He's sorry he could never be a proper father to me. Sorry he had to let me grow up thinking I was unwanted. Sorry he couldn't fight harder against the pressures that forced him to give me up." She wiped her eyes and continued reading. "He says that he loved my mother more than anything in the world, and that I was the greatest joy of his life, even though he could only watch me from a distance." "Does he mention the succession?" Sir Richard asked carefully. "Yes," Margaret said, turning to the second page. "He says that he formally renounced his claim to the throne because he believed his brother would be a better king. But more than that, he says he never wanted the throne for himself or for his children." She looked directly at William as she read the next part. "He says that kingship should go to those who are trained for it, who understand the responsibilities, and who have the support of the people. He says that my cousin, that's you, William, would be the rightful king not because of birth order, but because of preparation and suitability." Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her, but Margaret wasn't finished reading. "But he also says something else," Margaret continued. "He says that while I should never seek the throne, I should also never forget that I am royal blood, and that I have a responsibility to serve the family and the country in whatever way I can." William was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with emotion. "Margaret, I want to offer you something," he said. "Not because you have a claim to the throne, but because your family and because your father was right about service and responsibility." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I want to offer you a place in the royal family. An official role with a title that recognizes your heritage and gives you the opportunity to serve that your father wanted for you." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "William, I never wanted—" "I know," William said, "but think about what your father would have wanted. He wanted you to know your family, and he wanted you to have the chance to serve. This would give you both." Catherine reached over and took Margaret's hand. "You've already become such an important part of our lives," she said. "The children adore you, and you bring stories and perspectives about the family that we never would have known otherwise." "What kind of role?" Margaret asked, clearly overwhelmed. "We could create a position for you as a cultural historian for the royal family," William suggested. "You could help preserve family history, work with the archives, represent the family at cultural events. It would be meaningful work that honors your heritage without disrupting the constitutional succession." Margaret was quiet for several minutes, rereading sections of her father's letter and clearly thinking deeply about William's offer. "There's one more thing in the letter," she finally said. "My father says that the greatest gift he could give me would be the chance to know my family as family, not as subjects to their sovereign." She looked around the room at all of them: William, Catherine, Sir Richard, the palace staff who had become invested in her story, and smiled through her tears. "I would be honored to accept your offer, William, not because of any claim to succession, but because you're offering me the thing I've wanted most my whole life, the chance to belong to a family." As they spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the practical details of Margaret's new role, Catherine found herself thinking about how differently this day had turned out from what she had expected. She had been preparing for constitutional crisis, for challenges to William's right to the throne, for upheaval that could have torn their family apart. Instead, they had gained a new family member who brought with her not threats or demands, but love, service, and a deep respect for the responsibilities that came with royal heritage. That evening, as they shared dinner with Margaret and the children, Catherine watched William teaching his newly discovered cousin how to play Charlotte's favorite card game, while George explained the rules of cricket, and Louis showed off his collection of toy airplanes. "Aunt Margaret," Charlotte asked as they finished dessert, "will you come to my school play next week? I'm playing a princess." I wouldn't miss it for the world, Margaret replied, and Catherine could see the genuine joy in her eyes. Later that night, as Catherine and William were getting ready for bed, they reflected on the incredible journey of the past few weeks. I was so afraid, William admitted as they lay in the dark. I was terrified that everything we had built for our family was about to be taken away. Instead, our family got bigger, Catherine replied, snuggling closer to him. And stronger, I think. Do you think Uncle Edward would be proud of how this all turned out? William asked. Catherine thought about the letter Margaret had shared, about a father's love for a daughter he could never publicly acknowledge, about a man who chose service over personal ambition. I think he would be very proud, she said. His daughter gets to know her family, his nephew gets to be the king he was meant to be, and the monarchy gets to add someone who truly understands the meaning of service. As they drifted off to sleep, Catherine thought about how sometimes the doors we're most afraid to open led not to the endings we fear, but to the beginnings we never knew we needed. The truth behind Margaret's door had indeed changed everything, but it had changed it for the better, bringing together a family that was stronger and more complete than it had ever been before.